Namaskar, Sai Deepak. I have Mr. J. Sai Deepak with me here. He's a brilliant lawyer, but his story is also a bit intriguing because he did his education in engineering and then switched over to law. So the first question, inevitably, I have to ask to you, Sai, why did you switch over from engineering to law?
So, as someone who is a huge fan of Abdul Kalam as well as Wernher von Braun, my goal was to specialize in aeronautical engineering ultimately and become an aerospace engineer. While I could not get aerospace engineering in my undergraduation, I started off with mechanical and I wanted to pursue a master's in aerospace. Around the 7th semester or so of my engineering, I somehow decided that while engineering is something that I love, I'm cut out for a profession which requires me to interact with the public, and I wanted to contribute to public policy in some way or the other and make a difference to national discourse. And I couldn't think of a better option than law to train myself and understand how the system works and understand how the system works from inside and get a ringside view of how it operates. And also, if the system needs a change, I must be in a position to suggest a few changes which are feasible in the long run. And apart from that, I've always loved public speaking. I've always had a voracious, diverse interest in reading. I've taken an interest in current affairs, logic, reasoning, analysis. All of this appeals to me, and I couldn't find a better subject which puts all of this together in one single crucible, and therefore law, according to me, was the only logical choice. Of course, I could have opted for civil services, but civil services comes with a fair amount of fetters on your individual freedom, and sometimes you may not be in a position to voice your views as much as you can being a lawyer. So considering that, I felt that my interest, my aptitude and my personality found a better sync in law than any other profession, hence law.
I could agree with you as far as the fetters on the freedom of civil servants are concerned. I am experiencing it myself, though I do find some ways of getting around it. So the next logical question is that, okay, you say that you chose law to get a ringside view of how the system functions. But I believe that you found your calling in the intellectual property rights sphere of law. That's where you did most of your earlier practice, and it is only in the last 2-3 years that you branched out into other spheres of law.
Right.
So could you give us a consistent view of that?
Right. So, as someone who comes from a traditional South Indian family which has produced only engineers and lawyers, law was never an option. It was never even in the basket of options as far as I was concerned. So, when I decided to make the switch to law, I wanted to convince my parents to some extent that I was going to practice in a certain area of law which still has some kind of a nexus to my engineering roots. And intellectual property rights gave me that particular option. Apart from that, the law school which I opted for was the IIT Kharagpur Law School, which is known as the Rajiv Gandhi School of Intellectual Property Law, which was offering and which continues to offer an LLB with a specialization in intellectual property rights. And like most engineers in India, there is always a certain fascination for IIT, no matter how irrational or unreasonable it may sound. So I wanted to undergo that particular experience and see what it means to be a part of an institution such as IIT, and also as part of the first batch of a course. So this gave me an opportunity to set a few benchmarks, and as the product of the first batch, you end up laying down certain traditions. So that's one. But intellectual property rights was never my area of first choice. It is something that I took up because I had certain commitments, and therefore I opted for a commercial area of practice such as intellectual property law so that I could finish my responsibilities towards my family. But the goal was always to move towards more diverse and general areas such as constitutional law. So in the first 4 years of my practice, when I was part of a law firm, I focused extensively on intellectual property law, but not exclusively on intellectual property law. And from the fourth year onward, I had started branching out to competition law and other areas. When I quit that firm in June 2016, I was an associate partner of the firm. But by then I decided that I wanted to practice solely as an arguing counsel. So put it in simple terms, the practice of an arguing counsel is similar to that of a barrister in England, which is that your clients are primarily lawyers who engage you to argue on their behalf and on behalf of their clients in courts. And as someone who would develop a bit of a reputation as someone who could argue in court on his own without the need for a senior, I decided that this is where my destiny lay, and therefore I made that switch. And so when you make that switch to an arguing counsel, you cannot limit yourself to a special area of law. You can have certain subjects in which you are good at, but you must be in a position to argue across practice areas. And that is when I decided to indulge my passion in constitutional law and also take up causes which I relate to and represent them in the best possible fashion, given that I've been in the profession for close to a decade now, and give it a more systematic sheen when it is represented in court, because that's one thing that I think that the Indic side has suffered from, that our causes have not been given the best of representations. I don't blame anyone for this. I simply feel that there is more passion than reason in our representations, and I wanted to change that balance and blend to a certain extent. Hence, today if you ask me whether I'm an intellectual property lawyer, I would call myself a general litigator who practices as an arguing counsel, with civil commercial litigation and constitutional litigation being his areas of strength, and intellectual property being one of his areas of core strength. That is the long-winded answer that I would give to that question.
Today, when we were discussing the civilizational narrative in the Jaipur dialogues, you made some very interesting remarks, and one of which struck me particularly was that we have to find all our answers within the four corners of this book called Constitution.
Correct.
My take on the Constitution is similar, but the point is that I am finding that the book is not being adhered to by the people who matter, especially the judges of the highest court, in its true letter, nor in its true spirit. Now that makes the job of a lawyer very, very difficult, because I also did a bit of law. I did my LLB, and one of the few things that jurisprudence taught us, that one of the basic features of law was that it should be consistent and it should be predictable.
Right.
Now these two things seem to be totally missing, because it could completely change with the change in the constitution of a bench. So how do you tackle this uncertainty and this inconsistency which has become a hallmark of our judicial system?
So I think that's a fantastically well put question, and I don't know if it's your personality speaking or your training as a lawyer, but I think the question has been aptly captured, because the one thing that is a constant refrain in our circle, so to speak, and when I mean the Indic circles, is that they tend to see the Constitution as an anti-Indic document or an anti-Indic instrument. If a certain book is capable of, let's say, 3 different interpretations, and the body which is responsible for its interpretation, or the people who are responsible for its interpretation, choose to give it one particular interpretation, that doesn't point to a problem with the book itself, but to the lens under which it is read, to the eyes which see it and the minds that apply it or enforce it or interpret it. So whenever there is a discussion of articles 26 to 30, the assumption is that these are fundamentally lopsided articles which give preferential treatment to certain communities over others. If you were to go through these provisions, on the face of it, these provisions are capable of being interpreted in a very balanced fashion and without injustice being meted out to the Indic communities. The question is of whether there is an inherent bias in those provisions, or has the bias crept in as a consequence of certain socio-economic and politico-economic ideologies that choose to interpret it in a certain fashion. And that means it is a human intervention that is a that has effectively interfered with the plain text of a book or the plain text of the constitution. So to my mind, I see where you're coming from, that over the years systematically the sentiment that the institution which is meant to protect the constitution and enforce the constitution is perhaps not adhering to its history, its context, its reference, its spirit and its letter. And this is not something that that is a view shared by one school of thought. It is a view that is shared by all schools of thought and all ideologies, meaning thereby that the institution has not found itself a popular let's say mandate from any ideology. If you were to ask the left or the right or the center, each of them would have a certain complaint as far as the Supreme Court is concerned and as far as the judiciary is concerned when it comes to its interpretation. Perhaps the Indic side more so than others. What has happened over the years is, as opposed to interpreting the provisions of the constitution with reference to the Constituent Assembly debates which you referred to in the morning rightly, and at best giving it a certain stretch which is still permitted by the spirit of that particular language and the intent behind that particular language, we have stretched it to a point where it is now subject to individual whim and fancy, and that is being presented as constitutional morality, which I think is seriously problematic. But then people could say that, isn't that how judiciary all over the world functions, that the position of constitutional morality varies with the dominant ideology of that particular day? Perhaps that is the case. But since we are asking ourselves what should be the ideal position, I would basically say that it is important for us to stick to the text, to be textual if not literal, and be conservative in our approach for a very good reason. The body which is tasked with the power to enforce and interpret the constitution is an unelected body. It is a body which is not accountable. Its functioning and its operation is not entirely under the light of the sun. And as a consequence, people do not have the option of asking the very same questions to members of the judiciary which they could perhaps pose to the elected members of the parliament. Which is precisely why independence of the judiciary must go hand in hand with judicial restraint. Unfortunately, independence of the judiciary it has become more of a rights-based discourse as opposed to judicial restraint, which is perhaps the duty aspect of it. I think it's time this balance is brought back so that the institution regains more confidence and respect and retains its confidence and respect from the people. Because at the end of the day, an institution which cannot respect the limits within which it is supposed to operate ends up losing respect and confidence in the eyes of the people. I think that's something that the institution must realize, because rule of law at the end of the day can be maintained only if people continue to believe in the institution and its ability to dispense justice. The day you lose that, rule of law automatically falls and fails and flounders.
There is a related question to this. Of course, you rightly said that the courts have to derive their respect from their respect to rule of law, and unless they respect rule of law, they cannot expect the people to respect them. Because in the end, a statute which permits them to put people into jail for 3 months is not going to be much of a deterrent, because we have seen the examples when people are ready to take bullets on their chest.
Correct.
For a cause.
Correct.
So that's not something that the Supreme Court should be ruling by, which it seems to be doing right now. My difficulty is a little different. I seem to sense that the Supreme Court at present somehow seems to be distrustful of democracy. That is why you see that every time there is some exercise of rightful power to be done by the democratic institution, it seems to step in and curtail that. This CBI business, the CVC business is the latest, but this is not the first one. There's a whole litany of such instances. The kind of espousal for an all-powerful Lokpal, which sits on top of an elected government, I think that also seems to be a discourse headed in that direction. I think this is a kind of totalitarianism being brought in through the back door, and it is being done by people who talk only of the individual liberty.
Right.
I was really alarmed by the special emphasis given to the dignity of individual, that this constitution is made only for the dignity of individual, that would be the ultimate pursuit of happiness, which is a straight quote out of the American Constitution. Now, taking that, in fact, I mentioned that today, that the Venezuelan example. So you take the rights discourse to a level where it becomes disruptive, you disrupt the institution, you demolish the government of the day, you take it over, and then after that you completely bury the rights, you completely bury the courts, you completely bury the institution, and you bring in a totalitarian regime. Do you agree with me that this could go this way if this much needed judicial restraint is not employed?
If things pan out the way that they currently are playing out, then people will fundamentally lose faith in the concept of democracy and democratic institutions, for the simple reason that the highest court of the land, which swears by democracy and democratic values and constitutional values, if it constantly undermines any dispensation which has the mandate of the public and chooses to interfere with every aspect of governance and every aspect of public life, social life, cultural life, then effectively people will be forced to look at alternative models of governance. And this is human tendency. Therefore, I think it's imperative that institutions remain within their boundaries and observe a sense of caution when they push a certain point of view beyond a certain acceptable limit. Most importantly, what we must remember is, so I was in Israel a few weeks ago, or maybe a week ago. It is the Likud party, which is the right of center party in Israel, which brought about the new basic law with respect to human dignity and liberty in 1999, which is effectively the Charter of Rights. And the right of center party was the one to do it in the first place, and not the left of center party, which was in power from 1948 to 1977. That party, whenever it is in power, always experiences a belligerent Supreme Court, Israeli Supreme Court. And I then realized that this was not a coincidence, that whenever there is a right of center party, somehow for some reason the Supreme Court in whichever country takes upon itself the responsibility of giving an institutional pushback for the sake of it and not for any valid reason. And this, I think, is a fundamental ideological tussle. Point number two, in the past few judgments which have been pronounced by the Supreme Court, increasingly the Supreme Court is looking at itself and perceiving itself as the mechanism that is going to push back a majoritarian government or a government which enjoys majority. It's almost as if the Supreme Court has taken it for granted that any government that enjoys a majority mandate must necessarily be an evil government and must be checked. That, I think, is problematic, because that disrespects and insults the mandate of the people who've chosen to repose faith in one party. Therefore, the Supreme Court cannot say that the standards of pushback and the degree of pushback will be lesser if there is a coalition government, because we have seen how coalition governments can be corrupt in the last 10 years from 2004 to 2014. Therefore, a coalition government is no guarantee of democracy or independence or free speech, and a majority government is not antithetical to any of these constitutional democratic values. Because I've seen this reference over and over again in the Aadhaar judgment and several judgments. Dissent is important, but dissent with responsibility and for a certain purpose is important. If it proceeds unbridled, unchecked and unrestrained, I think the institution which is meant to preserve democratic values would end up facilitating anarchy. That is where the problem lies.
You're quite right. Dissent for the sake of dissent certainly cannot be a constitutional value. Now, I'll just ask you a last question, which can be quite dangerous. Judicial excess is controllable. But we have examples of many countries where judicial excess results in executive reaction. And if judicial excess leads to executive excess, then we go over the brink. We saw that during the emergency. The emergency was triggered by a judicial pronouncement.
Correct. So, as far as I am concerned, sanity will be the first casualty whenever there is an excess, especially if there is an excess which is unaccountable. An elected government and elected officials are subject to multiple checks and balances, and at the end of the day they can be replaced once in 5 years. When an institution lacks any of these safeguards, right from its appointment to let's say remission of office, and the ability to hold them to account if there are allegations of moral turpitude or integrity or otherwise. And if that institution pushes the envelope beyond a point, as I said, it endangers the concept of democracy. And the independence of judiciary was meant to curb executive excess. But if independence of judiciary results in judicial activism beyond acceptable limits, what recourse do the other organs of the state have? If they do not have recourse to any other check or balance, is it possible for us to not think of a situation where, as you rightly said, we go over the brink? I don't think it is beyond the realm of reasonableness, or it's beyond the realm of conception that such a thing can necessarily happen, and which is precisely why, if we are to maintain our respect and credibility as the largest and perhaps the most vibrant democracy in the world, a colorful, chaotic, vibrant democracy, it is imperative that all organs of the state remember that they have certain red lines which they are never supposed to cross, and if they do so, they would play into the hands of those forces who would love to watch India break and have popcorn and Pepsi.